Hey, welcome back to Pro Studio Live. I'm your host Elmo, here with Ian Sutton, and we're talking about equalizers. First segment we talked about a little bit of the history and a little bit of a background into equalizers, and now we're going to be getting into the different types of equalizers there are and their functionalities. Ian?
All right. Well, one of the first things I want to hit, because boy, that last hour went really quick. Mm-hmm. And you had mentioned resonant filters and some sweeps, and I think I said we'd get to that. So I want to just really quickly touch on that before we actually go into the differences between some of the more popular EQs. So I have the filter bank from McDSP pulled up here, and it's basically a high pass and a low pass filter. This is an awesome filter for dance music and things that you want that cool filter sweep to happen on, because we have the frequency, we've got the different orders. So first order, 6 dB, 12 dB, 18 and 24. Plus we have this peak here, and this peak creates that resonance.
Oh, wow.
And that resonance is, I think, what you were talking about. That resonance is a big boost right at that cutoff.
Okay.
Sorry if I'm using a term we didn't talk about, cutoff, meaning the cut frequency. So let's just take a quick listen to how that sounds. Actually, let's do this one. Kind of cool. So a regular filter, just kind of like that. Nothing fancy, nothing flashy. But if we push the peak up and we get a resonance on there,
That was the whistling thing I was talking about. That's definitely very fascinating. Is that a separate band of equalization on this particular plugin, or is that a functionality of a high pass or a low pass filter?
That's a functionality of certain high pass and low pass filters. The 7-band EQ that we had pulled up here earlier doesn't have a peak or a resonance value on their low pass and high pass filters.
Okay.
So you'll see these resonant filters or resonant peaks a lot on like synthesizer filters.
Okay.
So like the Moog filters, those type of things, they're really geared towards electronic music and those type of things. And one of the reasons is because they have this resonant band or this resonant capability.
Okay. That's cool. So let's take a look at some other equalizers and what functionalities they may offer that other equalizers might not. You had already shown us the API 550 series and the 560 series. What other EQs do you like to use in your productions?
I really enjoy. Well, let me get this one out of here. I want to use this one to show you something later.
Okay.
So the 550s, the 560s are great. The Neve 1073s are a classic. Let me see here. Sorry, I had a whole little thing here planned out. So when we talk about EQs, they feel like they do the same thing, right? I mean, they take a frequency and they boost it. Why are there so many of them out there? If they all do the same thing, why do we have a billion to choose from? Why do some engineers go, I love this one over, I love that one? And the reason for this is they handle the frequencies differently. Some of them boost, really boost and cut differently. So like the API, the 550 that we showed you earlier, that guy, when you boost the EQ, when you boost the frequency band, it kind of changes the Q.
Okay. The bandwidth changes as it increases or boosted or cut?
Yeah. Exactly. That's a great way to say it. The bandwidth increases or decreases as you boost it up. Instead of just taking and going like this, it kind of goes something like that.
It kind of shapes itself.
Yeah, and they call that a proportional Q.
Okay.
So the Q value is the bandwidth, and the API has a proportional Q, and that gives it its certain sound when you kind of crank it, when you push it a certain way. Something like the Neve like the Neve 1073, that doesn't have a proportional cue. So when we push up a frequency or push down a frequency with the Neve, it's smoother. It's not quite as aggressive, but it's very present. And that's because the Neve doesn't have that proportional cue. Let's see. So most digital EQs don't really add any kind of extra characteristics beyond, really beyond just boosting and cutting frequencies. Analog EQs, or like we're going to be using here, I suppose I can get rid of these for a second. Analog EQs or representations of them, they add some of the kind of the characteristics that give them their signature sound, like the way that the electronics kind of add a little bit of harmonic distortion to the signal, or like tube electronics, they add a little bit more, a little bit of harmonics also to the signal. So let's see.
Do we have any examples of a tube EQ pulled up on here? Are there any plug-in manufacturers that might make models of tube EQs?
We do, yeah. There's a few really popular tube EQs. The Pultec EQP1A is it's probably one of the most popular analog EQs. That guy, I do have one of those.
It's a fantastic EQ.
It's a great EQ, but it's confusing. It doesn't make sense when you look at it, right?
It's not a conventional one, that's for sure.
No. And this gives its own really rich, smooth character. The way that this EQ handles, especially the low end and the high end, well, that's really what it handles. But the way in which it handles it gives it an advantage over just a regular digital EQ. So the way that this thing works is it's got a boost. So if you could draw a triangle around here, that would be one band. And then if you could draw a triangle around here, that would be really another band.
So this is effectively a two-band equalizer.
Give or take, pretty much, it's a two-band equalizer.
Okay.
You've got the low band and then the high band. And the high band can be kind of split up into your boost and your cut.
Okay.
But it's kind of interesting. So we have 100 hertz here, and we have a boost. And we also have that same 100 hertz and an attenuation or a reduction.
Okay.
So that's a term we haven't gone over yet. Attenuation means reduction. So you can boost the frequency, and you can also cut that same frequency. It's not actually cutting the same frequency. It's cutting it a little ahead of it.
Okay.
Should we take a listen to how that
Sure.
sounds?
Yeah, let's do that.
It's a very, very unique characteristic. So we definitely get more bass. And then if we use the attenuation knob, it kind of evens out that bass a little bit. I'll bypass it. That's obviously too much.
Yes. It definitely illustrates the effect of what exactly is happening, though. You're increasing a generous amount of frequencies centered around 100 hertz, and then you're also showing that it can kind of tailor that sound a little bit.
Yeah, it cuts. Let me pull up a parametric EQ, and I'll just actually show you what it's doing.
Sure. That might be a great way to illustrate it.
So if we pull up the EQ3, essentially what's happening there is it's making a boost like this. It's also adding a little cut down there. So that curve, give or take a little bit, is really what this EQP1A is doing when you boost and you attenuate.
Okay. And then there's the bandwidth modifier right there. What exactly, how does that affect? Does that affect both the boost and attenuation?
It does affect the boost and the attenuation. It doesn't really affect it too much on the low end, actually. I found this really sonically affects more along the lines of what's happening up here at the top end.
Okay.
So let's take a quick look at the top end of this. And this is I love using this EQ for bass instruments and for like cymbals. It sounds incredible on the low end. The way that it boosts the low end just sounds tight and creamy and rich and warm and full, and it's a beautiful EQ. And then the top end, or the treble, the high frequencies, are very silky and very smooth. So you don't get that kind of harsh digitaliness that you get a lot of times with just the regular factory stock EQ in Logic or Pro Tools. Excuse me. So let's boost the highs. So actually, we have a high frequency here we can choose. So we can choose 3 kilohertz all the way up to 16 kilohertz. So if we boost something like 5K. We then now, on the attenuation knob, we actually have a different selector for the frequency of the attenuation. So we can attenuate 5K. Kind of cool.
I can definitely hear how it's changing what it's changing.
It feels like it's crisper and cleaner without being harsh. It's really, really nice. And
now,
then,
with an EQ like this, just quickly touching on something we mentioned last segment, what is this going to be introducing a lot of phase, or because it's a tube equalizer, is that different, or is it just kind of safe to assume that most equalizers will be affecting the phase of what you're applying it to?
well, the design of the Pultec is actually a passive EQ.
Okay.
So it's not actually adding any boosting during the equalization phase or equalization stage.
Okay.
It uses phase differences to basically carve out frequencies, and then it uses an amplifier stage to boost up the amplifier at the very end.
Okay.
So it doesn't actually. Most EQs will actually boost at the frequency
Okay.
instead of just cutting and then boosting up the overall signal at the end. So it's kind of interesting the way this one does. So this one feels really solid and very tight.
So it won't be changing too much of the phase relationship of whatever you're applying it to, if you're using this EQ to affect one part of maybe a number of things playing together, like a choir or a bass guitar, for example. It might keep a little bit more of the phase relationship intact.
I want to say yes.
Okay.
I think if you do huge EQ boosts, though, you're probably still
Right.
You can still run into that
In modest amounts, of
Yes.
course. Okay, that's pretty cool. What about something that a lot of my peers use as an equalizer is an SSL EQ or an SSL style EQ. Is that like a solid state EQ, or is that a tube EQ? How would that be different than the API series?
Well, yeah, the SSL is a solid state EQ. It's a pretty world-renowned console EQ. It's on. You've heard the SSL EQs on probably tons of your favorite records. Hip hop from the 80s and 90s, like probably anything Dr. Dre does, mixed through an SSL. SSL EQ all over it. SSL is punchy, very precise, but the SSL EQs are fully parametric, I believe. Whereas the API is just a semi-parametric. So you can't dial in the exact frequency. You have to boost and cut based on what API thinks are good frequencies.
Right.
So yeah, the SSL EQs are extremely popular.
Now, what in your experiences, when would you reach for, say, an API EQ, something that's kind of sort of parametric, partially parametric, and then something more of like an SSL style EQ that would be fully parametric? What elements of a mix would you reach for the SSL over the API? Given for a rock track like this, what might you want to use an API for?
Well, API typically has a little bit more of a aggressive tone to it.
Okay.
So the parts that I might want to be a little bit more aggressive, maybe reach for an API. But I feel like the SSL can kind of give you that as well.
Do you think it might just come down to an instance of taste, maybe something that you found this EQ, you just like it, and maybe on a guitar it just works every time, and so you've developed this kind of relationship, knowing, or is it something that this EQ is designed for guitar?
Oh, gosh, I would say it's taste.
Okay.
It's a taste thing. I mean, and to be honest, like when I mix, I like to have fun mixing, and sometimes I'll get a new tool and I'll use that one, and you can see like over my mixes over a certain period of time may sound slightly different because I'm like I just feel like using the API this month, and then if it doesn't do what I want it to do, I'll reach for something that has a little bit more control.
Okay.
And then sometimes I'll just go, hey, I just want to mix this whole thing with the SSL EQs. So it's really a taste thing. But one great thing about the SSL EQs is they're really flexible, incredibly flexible, and very solid EQs. So that's
the SSL it's 4 bands, but it's fully parametric. So you have the ability to control all of the frequencies, the bandwidth, and the gain of those bands. Let's say I have a bass guitar, or a vocal rather, that I only hear one weird frequency, for lack of a better phrase, and I want to remove that frequency. Would it be, I guess, unwise to load an SSL EQ that would have multiple bands, more bands than I would need for this application, or would you reach for a single band EQ and just get rid of that one weird frequency? What, in your experiences, would you do in a situation like that?
I like to have options. So really, when I'm mixing a track, I'm always constantly going back and changing things. A little bit here, a little bit there, go back and change that EQ a little bit. So I like to have the option to go back and add something else later, or take away something else later, frequency-wise. So that's one thing about EQ is it's, especially during the mix, well, really during the mix, it's always changing. I never just EQ an instrument early on, and then that's it, and never come back to it. I'll work with an instrument, try and get it to sound how I want it to sound, pull other instruments in, make sure it works with those other instruments, and then go back and mess with it more. One
thing we're going to be getting into a little bit later in the show is soloing, and like you just mentioned, you're going to bring other things into it, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. But that's a good thing to note about. It all kind of depends, and you want to have those options available to help you shape. Let's say you hear that vocal and it has that weird frequency, you notch it out or you remove it, but 13 or so steps later in your mix, you realize that maybe that wasn't the right move to make. So I mean, it all kind of comes back around. It's good to kind of bring up. What about when you're working with a mix and you have these analog modeled EQs? Would you say that they're kind of introducing the same characteristics as an analog EQ to an extent over a purely digital EQ, like say the 7-band that we had, the AVID 7-band?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different models out there of a lot of different analog EQs. Some models are better than others.
Okay.
So some models impart a little bit more of that actual analog sound. So I think that's...
Does that usually, I mean, in some situations, I'm sure more than others, it would be a desirable effect. I know that some Neve EQs have a presence in the lower end that might be desirable for bass instruments, bass guitar, bass kick drum rather. You mentioned the aggressive nature of an API. Those sorts of things are all things to keep in mind when you're shaping your mix, right? Would you consider that like musical EQ or colorful EQ in a sense?
Yeah, I would say both.
Okay.
The different especially when you look at like the semi-parametric EQs, when they have certain frequency bands. A lot of records that you love were made with these consoles, and part of the sound of them is only being able to boost a certain frequency. So yeah, part of that analog sound, part of the sound goes with just being being limited with what the boosts and the cuts that you can actually do.
The sheer limitation only allows you certain options.
Yeah, and if you have the ability to, to get your hands on some of these different models, for Waves, Universal Audio, even McDSP has their channel strip, or I'm sorry, their ultimate. Gosh, which one is it? Their EQ, their new EQ, the GEQ actually. That one will have SSL curves, API curves, and Neve curves.
Okay.
I suggest trying out the different curves. I mean, take one song that you've mixed, mix it all with the Neve curves.
Okay.
Then go and remix it with the API curves.
I'm glad that you kind of brought that up. I'd like to maybe take a moment and listen to this track or a portion of the track using a couple different EQs to see what they might sound like. I mean, some of our viewers might not have the availability to have these UAD plugins or what have you, but at least we might be able to show them what the Neve style EQ might do.
Yeah.
You want to give it a shot?
Absolutely.
Take a listen.
So let's pull up. Let's look at like the Neve, the 1073.
Okay.
Excuse me. If we let's give it a boost. Let's dial in a frequency that everyone should be able to hear, no matter what you're listening on, of about 3.2 kilohertz. So if we look at this, we've only got, in the mid-range, we've got 360 hertz, 700 hertz, 1.6 kilohertz, 3.2, 4.8, and 7.2. So
those are the only options available to us on these 1073 type EQs.
Yep.
Okay.
For the mid band of this. This is a 3-band EQ.
Okay.
And it actually has a 4th band that is the cut. That's a nice, pretty fair boost. I think this goes up to about 20 dB. I don't know the exact specs on this, but I'm going to kick it up where I think it is lives at about 12 dB, somewhere right around there. I'm going to do that because we've got an API over here on this other duplicated channel strip, and the APIs only go up till 12.
Okay.
So what was the frequency that we had there?
3.2 kilohertz?
3.2. So luckily on the API here, we also have 3 kilohertz, which is not 3.2, but it's close.
That might be playing into part of its particular sound.
Exactly. You nailed it on the head. Part of that particular sound. It always helps when you unbypass it. So let's push that up. And then I'm going to solo back and forth between the two. Let's do it one more time, and let me pull this down just a little bit and really listen. You can hear the API feels a little bit more aggressive. The Neve feels a little smoother. And the reason for that is the Neve is actually, again, grabbing more frequencies around that center frequency.
It's not necessarily shaping the bandwidth of that frequency the way that the API one might.
And then the Neve also has just the high frequency is a 12 kilohertz shelf. That's all you get. But it sounds great. And then likewise on the API, if we crank that up on their shelf. Oops, there's that one's still up. The Neve may have been a little bit higher, but again, just different, different sounds. The Neve actually, I forgot to mention, the Neve on its boost and cut is a smooth boost and cut.
Okay.
The API only boosts and cuts in 2 decibel increments.
Oh, okay.
So if you need to go up 1 dB, you might not reach for an API.
Okay. That's interesting to note, the different functionalities just off of that, the way that the design will affect what your choices are, because at that point, if you wanted to only make a surgical 1 decibel cut, you really couldn't do that at all with any, well, maybe with the 560 of the API series, but
Yep.
with the 550s, there's no way.
Yep.
That's fascinating. Now, what about with an SSL style EQ? That one seems to be a little bit closer to the Neve style, where that's a smooth boost and cut, correct? It's not notched.
Yeah. So let's pull up an SSL here and just switch the Neve over just a little bit. If we grab, zoom in so everyone can see, the high mid frequency, we'll pull that up to, what was it, 3? 3.2?
3.2 was the Neve, but 3 was the API.
This one defaults to 3, so that's pretty good. Let's get our solo back there. And on this one, we do have to engage the EQ section.
So this particular plugin is resembling a whole channel strip of an SSL console?
It is.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah. This is the universal audio version. I know Waves makes a version that has just the SSL EQ. They have the channel strip and the EQ only. So the UAD version, again, it's the whole channel strip, the entire thing.
Chances are, if it's the same unit being modeled by a different company, that it will resemble each other. I mean, more alike than not, but they're going to have their own flavors because they're their own companies, right?
Yeah, they should share a high percentage of characteristics between the two. I mean,
so if you have the Waves version, if you have the UA version, it's not going to be much of a difference if you're already at that point, right?
Right. They should have the same, the same curves, the same bands and all that stuff.
Okay, let's take a listen.
So there's a SSL. We'll go back to API. SSL. API. API. SSL. So
Wow.
definitely a difference. The SSL, we've got the Q is at 1.5. So if we go lower on the Q value is actually a broader, more bandwidth. So lower Q, broader bandwidth.
Okay.
That is something that we didn't get to last segment. So yeah, higher Q, smaller the bandwidth.
Out of my own curiosity, do you happen to know why they may call the bandwidth Q?
Oh gosh, not off the top of my head.
There is information out there, though?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's I think
That's
the
good enough.
quality. I think it's a Q standard. I believe it stands for quality. The quality of the curve.
No.
I don't know. It's
Sure.
in there somewhere. So within SSL, you do have a lot more functionality, a lot more freedom to pick your own frequencies, pick the bandwidth you want, than you do with like an API and even with the Neve, because the Neve has a fixed, excuse me, the Neve has a fixed bandwidth.
Okay. Now, what might it sound like if we were to compare this SSL given that you have the ability to change the parameter of the cue, what would it sound like if we were to boost the same, if we took all the same information from that 3K boost and put it on the 7-band EQ from DigiDesign or AVID and compare the two? Would we hear a considerable difference between how an SSL would affect the source and how a digital counterpart might?
Let's find out. I hope so. All right, so what do we have here on the SSL? We've got 3K. Let's just go, I'm going to say that's probably about a 15 dB boost.
Okay.
And a Q of 1.5. Let's just default this guy out. So we'll dial in 3K. And a Q of 1.5. If I can get there. Almost, 1.5, there we go. And a gain of 15 dB. Let's hear the difference. SSL. Whoa. Let's turn the API off. Big difference, actually.
It almost sounds like the SSL is both broader and more narrow than the digital counterpart, but that also could just be the way that the EQ itself was designed.
Yeah, you know, the electronics and the way that SSL has made it sound, really.
That's fascinating. So one thing that we kind of accidentally realized was you had 2 EQs running a moment ago and your channel was clipping. That kind of piques my interest in that, you know, some people might not ever think about these boosts and cuts that are being made in the equalizer realm, adding and taking away gain or the peak value or the loudness. How does gain staging play into how an equalizer works?
Yeah, I mean, remember, an equalizer is a gain-based effect. You are boosting or cutting, you know, turning up or turning down the volume of a certain set of frequencies. Absolutely. When I use EQs, I try to keep the volume of or the gain or the level of the EQ roughly the same when it's engaged and when it's bypassed, because I want to be able to listen back to the original, and I want to make sure that there's not a big volume boost, because normally as humans, if we hear 2 things and we hear one a little bit louder, we think that one sounds better. So you want to make sure when you're EQing that you're not doing any damage. First off, you want to make sure that what you're doing sounds better, and you want to be able to bypass and unbypass your plugin and really not lose sight of that sound, or not lose perspective on that.
One thing I like to do is I'll have my EQ set and I'll bypass it and then re-engage it just to make sure that I'm at the same level, and then as I make my changes, I will adjust the input and the output, if I have the ability to, of my equalizer plugin to allow myself to continually bypass and re-engage without being jarred by the volume discrepancy, because that might change how I'm thinking the changes I'm making sound. I mean, is that a good practice to have when you're mixing or mastering or even tracking?
Absolutely. If you have that ability with an outboard EQ while you're tracking, yeah, definitely. But mixing, I do it all the time.
That also kind of brings me to another question. How do you approach equalization coming into Pro Tools? How would you approach EQing while tracking in an outboard situation?
Boy, you know, using EQs while tracking and outboard gear is a pleasure. They typically, the analog EQs, well, one of the problems we get into when we work with digital EQs is looking at the graph of the EQ, right? Seeing how that EQ looks. And with most analog EQs, there's a knob, you turn the knob, you listen, and that sounds great. So I love working with analog EQs while I'm tracking, partly because I'm not looking at a screen.
That makes sense.
You know, I can dial in the sound and I can sweeten it, make it sound a little bit better, and know that I'm really trusting my ears and I'm not kind of looking at, does that look right?
That's a good point that you just made. You got to trust your ears when you're working with anything audio. I mean, I know it's kind of a simple fact, but it's super important. You got to trust your ears more than anything, especially with computers and screens and nice, fancy looking graphics and whatnot.
And I try, and when I'm using EQ, when I'm recording, I'm trying to make broad moves.
Okay.
I don't want to add resonance, something that's hard to take away later. I really want to add these broad curves. So I can fix it later in the mix if I need to, but I can also get a little bit of that analog sweetness into there, injected right into Pro Tools beforehand. So I'll, like on a vocal, maybe cut a dip a little bit around 250 or something like that, and maybe add a nice little bit of air or a little bit of presence at somewhere between 3 and 5K, something like that. Maybe a few dB, not a lot, but just a little bit.
Something that you just mentioned actually kind of reminds me of another type of EQ made by a company called Moog. They have an air band that says that it's at about 40,000 hertz, but I mean, human ear can't hear that. Now, I've used that EQ on a number of different mixes and masters of my own, and I love the way that it sounds, even though technically I shouldn't really be able to hear that. Do you happen to have a plug-in version of that?
I do.
Could we maybe take a listen to what that exactly is doing?
We can. This session is actually recorded at 88.2, so there are frequencies living in the session that I don't know what everyone at home is actually hearing.
Okay.
But yeah, the Moog EQ is awesome.
Would it be something that, as it's changing, would maybe a frequency analyzer be able to show what's being changed, regardless of if it could be heard? Or how valuable are frequency analyzers in situations like this when you're working with equalizers, when you're trying to identify something to affect, whether it's a change or in a positive or in a negative boost or cut?
Oh yeah, analyzers, I definitely, I recommend, analyzers are a great tool to kind of help you hone in on something. Most analyzers go from about 20 to 20 though, 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. So with the Moog EQ, I mean, I know when you pump that up to 40 and you crank it up to 10, it's pushing 40, but it still kind of comes back and grabs around 20.
Maybe that's what I'm hearing, is because usually I'll end up cranking it pretty heavily, and in some cases when you crank the EQ, it might indicate that you need to redo something in the mic placement or restructure something. But I really just sometimes you do it and it sounds great, and that's kind of how I ended up with that. But that exactly might be what I'm hearing is I've cranked it so far that the center I can't hear anyway, but all of the other surrounding ones are being lifted.
Yeah, I've spent a fair amount of time with an analyzer and going through with a signal generator and just like playing with EQs and looking at the analyzer and seeing what it does. That's what I do on a Friday night. I nerd out like that. But yeah, the Moog EQ, it does go up to 40 kilohertz, and there are a lot of overtones and harmonics and stuff dancing around up there that you might not necessarily hear, but they interact with the frequencies that we can hear, and they can actually change how the frequencies that we do hear are reacting. So you might not necessarily hear that 40,000 hertz, but it may be bouncing around and changing the way something around 15K is sounding.
So everything is kind of being changed by everything else in a small phrase. So having said that, I want to kind of revisit something that I mentioned earlier, which was the topic of soloing. How does listening in solo affect what you're doing in regards to shaping your tone with an equalizer? Is it something that you would recommend doing? Is it something that you would recommend staying away from? What's your belief on soloing?
Yes, yes to everything. I mean, there's definitely different engineers will say, yeah, do it or don't do it, and I do it, and then I also don't do it. When you solo something, you're hearing that by itself. You're not hearing it how it reacts with the mix. So when I'm recording and using EQ when I'm recording, a lot of times I'll solo that instrument, and I want to kind of sweeten that instrument. I want to use those broad strokes, small decibel increments to kind of sweeten that sound like it is. When I'm mixing, they have to fit together. The instrument has to sound like it belongs in the mix. It might sound horrible by itself, but it fits perfectly in that little spot in the mix. So I'll solo a lot of times just to hear what that instrument's doing. So if there's some weird bass frequencies that are happening that I don't need, I can cut them out. But I will always, if I solo an instrument during the mix, always put it back into the mix and listen. I'd say about at least 50% of the time listening, EQing while it's in the mix and EQing on solo.
Man, I tell you, I was working on a mix last night actually, and I was really paying attention to the vocal, and I had soloed out the vocal track, right? Something that everybody does at some point in time. The vocals are the moneymaker of the song, so you really want to make sure you're not losing it. I got a little too close to it, meaning I spent a little too much time in solo mode, and it sounded phenomenal by itself, and I was really loving it, and then as soon as I hit the solo button to bring the whole track back into it, I couldn't tell you how bad it sounded. It really was just too much, and I felt like I lost sight of the whole song. Everything is changed by everything else, like you were like what you were just mentioning. The changes that you make have to make sense for everything. So I mean, what's your belief on getting too close to something, spending too much time on one instrument just with the EQ?
Yeah, your ears will play tricks on you after a while. You get used to the way something sounds, and then you want to make it sound a little sweeter, and then you get used to how that sounds, and then you want to make it sound a little sweeter, and it's a dance, definitely. So take a break. You hear everybody says that. Take a break, walk away, listen to something else. Right. Use a reference track, something like that. But always listen in the mix. If you're going to solo, that's awesome. If that helps you, if that's the way you have to do it, but put it in the mix. And then pull it out and solo and mess with it, and then put it back in the mix and listen. Don't ever go too long. And it's easy to say that here, but when you geek out and you're in it, you're like, you can go a long time, but you shouldn't. Yeah. And I'm definitely guilty of doing that.
Yeah, I feel like we all are. It's what we love to do. We're ultimately all in here to make things sound how we like it, and how the artist that we're working with likes it. So, I mean, it all plays into the bigger picture, and that's just something that I think is incredibly important and very, very valuable to have. But we're kind of reaching a point where we need to take a break again. So we talked a lot about this in this section about what the different EQs available to you can sound like and how they can help you to shape your instruments, your mix. In the next section, we're going to be talking a little bit more about some cool tips and tricks that we can use to help sweeten the sounds of individual elements. We'll be looking at different parts of this rock track that we have here. So stick around. We'll be back in a little bit.